Everybody hear me okay?
Mhm.
Good. Appreciate you guys having me. As Kevin said, I am with Creative Conservation. We are a family-owned and operated insulation company that started in 1981. My parents actually started it. I sold it recently in 2021 to True Team. True Team is a publicly traded company out of Florida with 13,000 installers across the United States. And it's been interesting to see a family business end up going with a publicly traded company, but it's been a really good mix, and they have a lot of support industry wide, and they are in every state. So Kevin asked me to come and talk about spray foam today, and I just wanted to kind of talk about the True Team thing. We are a full service insulation company. We do standard insulation, we do blown cellulose. So if a question arises about that, really feel free to ask it. Love to talk about some of those things too, not just spray foam. But I think spray foam is becoming such a popular product, and you guys are seeing it in a lot of attics and crawl spaces, and I'm sure there's some different questions about it. All right, so really foam comes in two versions: spray foam, open cell foam. This is that product, closed cell foam. This is a harder product. We can pass those around if you want to touch them. The biggest difference between the two: open cell has less R value. It's 3.7 per inch. It's never a vapor barrier. No matter how thick you spray it, it's never a vapor barrier. That product expands 100 to 1. In other words, when it's sprayed on, 100 to 1 liquid to growth. And it has a soft cell structure. It's an open cell structure. If you were to break that in half, you can see open cell structure. And then the blowing agent, typically in most all open cells, is some form of water. That's what blows it out. Closed cell is 6.9 per inch up to 7.2 per inch. It is the highest R value of any product there is. It is a vapor barrier at 2 or 2.5 inches, depending on the product brand. It expands 30 to 1, and it has a hard cell structure. And its blowing agent is hydrofluoroolefin. And Virginia is one of 5 states that does not allow hydrofluorocarbons to blow the agent anymore. The only reason you need to know that is that we are considered really on the cutting edge of promoting a foam that's healthier for the environment. If you were to see it in crawls or attics by the naked eye, you would never know. The old foam is not allowed to be sold into the state of Virginia anymore. So if you're looking at something older than 2 years, most likely it's a hydrofluorocarbon blowing agent. Really doesn't matter, other than the fact that, there's some debate whether it's healthy or not, and the new closed cell spray foams are a whole lot healthier. All right, so open cell. Open cell is a superior air seal. Open cell is a total project system using roof decks, walls, crawl spaces, and overhangs. It does require what's called a legacy report for use in unvented attics. I handed out a piece that has the description of an unvented attic on one side and crawls on the other. This is a sales piece that we hand out to customers to try to explain how unvented attics work. It is typically in the state of Virginia, most unvented attics that you see are going to be done in open cell foam. The majority of them are done in open cell foam. Some of them can be done in closed cell foam. Some people desire that higher R value, but most everything you're going to see in the state of Virginia is done in open cell foam. Open cell allows bulk water intrusion with drying capability. So a lot of people's questions about roof decks are, how am I going to know if my roof leaked? Bulk water will pass through open cell foam. It's difficult to tell under a roof deck where that leak started or came from. Where it shows up may not be where it started, but it does allow bulk water to come through it. So when you guys are inspecting roofs, it's very difficult, obviously, to tell the condition of a roof when it's completely covered with foam. But if a roof is leaking, it will come through the open cell foam. It's a great product for metal deck applications. If you're looking at metal roofs, we are getting a lot more calls for open cell foam in metal deck operations. All right, closed cell foam, same air seal. Both of them are wonderful air seal products. Like I mentioned before, it does have the highest R value of any product in the industry. The most common place that we are selling closed cell foam is crawl space walls. Instead of foam board, we often go in existing houses and spray closed cell foam on the crawl space walls. Closed cell does not allow bulk water intrusion. One of the big issues that they've had in roof deck rot outs is when people do choose closed cell foam on the underside of a roof deck, the water that comes through the shingle never shows itself in the structure. So a lot of roofs have been rotted out because the closed cell foam is trapping the moisture against the roof deck. It can be used in unvented attics. If you go north where vapor barriers are required, really Maryland and above, you are seeing a whole lot more closed cell attics than you do in the state of Virginia. Virginia has no vapor barrier requirements because they couldn't figure out, does it go on the outside or the inside? Because we truly are a 50-50 heating cooling market, so they couldn't figure out where the vapor barrier goes, so they eliminated it completely from the code. All right, so unvented attics. Insulation is applied to the under the side of the roof deck with no insulation separating the attic from the living area. Air impermeable insulation required, no bat. So unvented attics have been allowed by code since 2004, but it has to be an air impermeable insulation. You cannot do it with fiberglass bat insulation. Some of the older houses you go into, you will see it done with fiberglass bat. Since 2004, they will not allow you to do that. It has to be open cell or closed cell foam to create an unvented attic. So you eliminate all passive ventilation, gable, soffit, and ridge vents. So in other words, the house from the outside, the majority of the existing homes we do still has gable end vents, still has a beaded soffit, but it's all blocked from the inside. So none of the ventilation anymore that comes in from the outside gets into the attic. All that is blocked off. So you bring the HVAC equipment and ductwork into the conditioned space. The attic basically stays within 12 degrees of the house year round. So you can imagine how much more efficient your ductwork, your unit, and everything operates in an unvented attic versus a traditional attic that would be 120 degrees in the summer or 20 degrees in the winter. It improves indoor air quality, mainly because you remove the insulation that is in the attic, so you don't have fibrous insulation within your ductwork system anymore. It also keeps outdoor contaminants that enter the attic, whether that's dust, dirt. And back to what I was saying, the majority of the open cell attics that we sell, the majority of the attics that we sell are open cell in Virginia. Now, the foam may require thermal or ignition barrier. This is a big one for guys that are inspecting attics. In 2009, the code changed. We sprayed thousands and thousands of houses where we would spray foam the attic, walk away, and you didn't have to do anything to it at all. The rule changed in 2009. If an attic is deemed a storage attic, if there is enough flooring that they deem storage, meaning there's more storage than just 4 sheets of plywood or OSB, they deem that a storage attic. And those attics now are required to have a sprayed intumescent paint over the spray foam. Very difficult to see on open cell foam when you're looking at attics. Typically, this attic is not painted. Typically, you're gonna see white paint all over the rafters because you go in and paint the foam the day after you foam the attic. And that is required by code since 2009, unless it's an attic that all they deem is no storage attic, a truss attic, for instance, that might have 2 sheets of plywood, a pull down, and all you're doing in that attic is servicing the unit. That's deemed not a storage attic. But a walk-up attic of any type is a storage attic, and that's required to have either sheetrock or the paint over the foam. Any questions on that? I know you guys are seeing unvented attics probably more. So the paint gives it, depending on the thickness that you spray the paint, at 3 mils, it is what's called an ignition barrier. And it's basically a 15-minute ignition barrier. So it gives time, if a fire starts in the attic, it gives time to get out of the house. At a thermal barrier thickness, which is 9 mils or thicker, then that becomes a thermal barrier. That's actually a 1 hour burn versus the foam, the same as sheetrock would be.
Can you go in more about when the thermal is required versus when the ignition is required? And how we can identify it and whether the product has to have it? And is it supposed to be labeled in any way?
Those are great questions. It is something that our industry and the inspection industry is really struggling with. There is no way, especially to this product right here, that any of us can tell the proper millage of paint that was sprayed on this particular product. It is a problem. We have to provide paperwork that says whether we sprayed it to ignition or thermal barriers.
To the owner?
I'm sorry?
Provide paperwork to each job?
We have to the inspector when it was done from a new construction standpoint, absolutely. From an existing standpoint, and we do a lot of it in existing work, we don't have to report that. There's nothing that says existing insulation has to be inspected. It is best practice when you are selling it to a homeowner, especially when you're painting it, that you do give that paperwork to them. But if it was at one time, if it was done as a new home, it absolutely had to have that paperwork at the inspection process. Did that answer that?
Partially, but if you have a walk-in attic and part of it is floored and part of it is not, do you have to separate the part that's floored from the other part with an ignition barrier?
If you go into a walk-up attic and that entire attic is foamed.
No, half of it is. Oh yeah, the entire attic is foamed.
But only half of it's floored.
Right.
The entire attic has to have an ignition barrier over it.
Right.
Yes.
Which is either sheetrock or the intumescent paint that goes out to 6 inches.
That's
or 6 mils.
6 mils. Yes.
Okay. 6 mils.
Correct.
We had another.
Well, 3 mils is an ignition barrier, 9 mils as a thermal barrier. But ignition barrier is all that's required in attics, in residential construction. Back to your other question. Thermal barrier is required when it is a living space. If you were to leave foam exposed in a living space, for instance, if you were to go have a basement that you were using as a man cave or something, and you didn't have any drywall on the walls and you foamed the walls, and it was evident that you were using it, pool table, ping pong table, something like that, then that is a thermal barrier. That's a living space. Attics are always ignition barriers because you're not living in it.
They're always.
Well, you guys might see some attics that people are living in, I guess, but. Yep.
In an older house where you do this, that already has insulation above the ceilings, do you leave that insulation there, take it out, or does it matter?
That is a great question. In fact, let me skip ahead to that. Okay. So manufacturer recommends that insulation needs to be gone. And we are seeing a lot, and we as a company, if we sell an existing home, that is part of what we're selling them.
Do you mind if I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah,
Could you
go ahead.
restate the question? The microphone wasn't on, so the online
Sure.
audience is concerned that they didn't understand what you're talking about.
He asked that if it's an existing attic that has a spray foam roof deck, if you go into a house, can you leave that insulation in the floor? And the answer is a lot of people do it, but the best practice is that it goes. And the manufacturer recommends that it goes because you want passive air transfer from the living space into the attic. The other big issues that they had in the past was that the foam would actually hold, excuse me, the insulation, the fibrous bat or blown insulation would hold the smell of the spray foam. So you would never get rid of that smell. It would smell like plastic, like new carpet really is what it smells like. So best practice, manufacturer recommends it. And the other big thing is, and this picture kind of shows it, one of the keys about an unvented attic is you have to truly seal the attic to the drywall of that floor. It has to be a complete seal. Guys that leave insulation in there, you really don't spray foam down to the proper spot and make that seal. There is nothing that says it's got to come out, but best practice. And if you run across one, I would definitely recommend it because the house is going to perform a whole lot better with it gone. The other thing is all that fibrous material, that blown insulation, there's no, that dust and dirt doesn't escape outside anymore through the ventilation. So it comes back into the house. It actually makes for a dirtier house and you've lost the indoor air quality aspect of an unvented attic.
You may have already answered this sufficiently, but we got a question here from the Peanut Gallery about exactly what you were just talking about there. So then now that you're eliminating the ventilation, well, what about the humidity? I mean, are you conditioning that space now or?
That's a great question. So the industry uses the word semi-conditioned. Because the insulation is removed, you are actually circulating air from the rest of the house to that. Natural duct leakage, even the best duct systems leaking 8 to 10% of its air. So you are semi-conditioning that attic, whether you want to or not. So when you do that, again, removing the insulation aids in that entire attic being part of the structure. So the HVAC system is pulling air out of that attic, and that's what keeps the humidity down. All right, so the spray foam coated with an intumescent paint when deemed a storage attic, I talked about that. That's been coded since 2009. As far as you guys are concerned, and again, listening to your presentation, I never understand whether y'all need to make that recommendation. You're going to find attics that were sprayed in 2000, 2002, 2003, and obviously up to 2009 that are not going to have intumescent paint on it. That was not code then. It's been code since 2009. And it is really the best practice for a storage attic that it should be covered with an intumescent paint.
So Paul, you got your hand up?
Yes.
Paul Locke?
Yes. I've had a number of experiences in old houses that doesn't have open soffits, soffits, so solid wood. And the only ventilation they have are the old gable vents. And what has happened with me is that people call me out they have mold in their closets. And then when I go up in the attic, they have covered the gable vents with plastic for the winter and have left it covered. So none of the gases from the house are able to escape. My problem is, like I said, if you go in there and put all that stuff in the attic, then you won't be able to get I'm not sure that you'll be able to get gases that are created inside the house out of the house. Oh, you can't get them through the attic. I guess they could go through the crawl space, but you can't get them. I don't know. I just think that spray foam would somehow seal the, prevent the gases from escaping the house. What are you?
Well, in the case that you're talking about, and Richmond has a whole lot of this, a lot of the slate roofs in Richmond, they have no ventilation. Those were unvented attics anyway. Most of them, in fact, they introduced gable end vents to a lot of slate roofs that shouldn't have had them. And it caused some of the problems that you're talking about. The issue that you had with the mold and mildew is because they blocked those gable vents, but the temperature of the attic is still heating up to 120 degrees. The gable end vents are put there to allow the heat to escape the attic. That's the whole purpose of them. Well, if you spray foam the attic and you fight the fight under the roof deck, your attic is staying within 12 degrees of the rest of the house. So you're no longer having a 120-degree attic and creating those humidity problems that they were having on the living space floor. You definitely can't block the ventilation and not insulate the attic roof deck. That was the issue with what they did in that particular house.
So Tim, you got a question? Tim Fisher?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I understood. In unvented attics that have the spray foam insulation installed, you don't require that the HVAC ductwork actually be open to allow the air to pass through. Just leakage is sufficient?
Correct. In fact, and we'll get to it in crawl spaces in a moment. Because it's the high point of the house, the pressure point of the house, you know, you're feeding that anyway. You know, the air moves to that direction anyway. Again, manufacturer recommends no supply and no return in the attic. Some guys are adamant about putting supplies in the attic. We totally recommend against it because the manufacturer recommends against it. But no return or no supply in the attic. Duct leakage is sufficient for that.
Okay. That seems kind of odd to me, but okay, thank you.
Yeah. And you know, the thing, and again, I'm sure you guys are seeing more of them than you've ever seen, but I mean, this is still very, very foreign to people. I mean, again, it's been allowed by code since 2004, but it is still the condition crawl, which we'll get to in a minute. That's much more common. And you see that a whole lot more common than you see this. But I can tell you there's national builders, none in Virginia yet, but Meritage Homes, which is based out of Texas, they're huge in North Carolina and they're coming to Virginia. Every single house that they do is done this way, up the walls and up the roof deck. So it's a matter of it coming, and you're going to start to see it a whole lot more. Most of the houses that you guys are going to see were retrofitted that way, which is a big part of our business. They weren't originally sprayed that way. Now there are builders in this area and in Virginia Beach and in Richmond that do make it a standard. It's part of their package, but it's still the majority of them that you guys are going to see are going to be a retrofit application. It was done after the fact. Well, before I move on to any other unvented attic questions before I move on to crawls?
I say this gotta be great for hip roofs that have just that little teeny ridge vent at the top, and there's, you know, this ginormous floor space. So that's got to take care of a lot of ventilation issues there.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, Larry's got a question.
Go ahead, Larry.
What's an easy way to recognize first signs of water leaking? Does it have a certain color characteristic, or does it have a certain, are there certain places you should look always? Do you always see it causing problems in certain areas?
That's a great question. Often on the open cell foam where it leaked, you will see water color stains like from the shingles. You'll literally look like
We can't see you
through
from unless you move to the podium.
Sorry, buddy.
Oh yeah, there you go. Thanks.
Yeah. So you'll often see, you will see staining in the open cell foam. You'll literally see water lines that the dirt, you know, this almost acts like a filter, and you'll see dirty water lines. You'll also see it on the floor. So it will appear on the floor, which is a whole nother reason not to have the insulation there, because you'll recognize it when it's on the drywall versus falling in the batt insulation. Correct. We don't like to do it. There's plenty of people that do still do it. They want that higher R value. They want that structural strength. We don't like it in attics, but it is code approved and code allowed.
So when people don't use a mic, could you try to remember to just restate the question?
Yeah. His question was, do we still, because the water won't come through the closed cell foam, would we still use closed cell in attics? We don't like to do it. There's plenty of companies that do it. It is still code approved, but it is definitely difficult, if nearly impossible, to tell whether you have a roof leak.
Doesn't the closed cell void shingle warranties?
That's a great question. So, in the beginning, shingle companies did not get on board with it. However, CertainTeed is in the spray foam business. So now they will warrant shingles. The last one that wouldn't was Owens Corning. And Owens Corning wasn't in the foam business. Johns Manville's in the shingle and the foam business, so they warrant shingles. GAF, they're not in the foam business, but all of their shingles are warranted. Well, Owens Corning last year bought a foam company, so I would think soon they will warrant their shingles too. That's a great question. We have to provide that letter often that the warranty is not voided
Yeah,
by spraying foam under the
I'm
roof deck.
Friends with a roofing consultant, and he pointed that out to me years ago, that that you can't use closed cell. And in fact, I think that's still his thoughts on it. So.
Yeah. Yes.
I don't know if you've run into this, but I saw at a home and garden show a couple weeks ago that Tesla is actually making solar shingles.
Wow.
Yeah, so they're like 3 foot long by 12 or 14 inches wide, and they integrate in just like slate wood. So I haven't had a chance to get the guy to maybe come to one of these and speak, but have you run into anything like that?
I have not. I haven't seen that.
Okay.
That's great. That'd be a pretty powerful combo to have an unvented attic with solar shingles on it.
If you don't have a second zone of heating, cooling up in the attic, is the argument for this diminished greatly versus just putting more on top of the ceiling?
That's a great question. And yes, if you do not have an HVAC system in the attic, you really lose one of the biggest bangs for your buck, which is having your unit and your ductwork in a friendly environment. So if you have no attic if you have no HVAC system in the attic, the unvented attic doesn't make as much sense. And back to the earlier question, there's still people that want it because they want to use a storage attic. So they want to use it. That is a good idea to actually use a fan to bring air from the house into the attic because you don't have a unit up there semi-conditioning that space. But to your point, you lose one of the big factors out of it. And for instance, in Northern Virginia, there's a whole lot less unvented attics because most of those homes have a basement. The unit goes down into the basement, which is a super efficient place to put the unit. So they spray foam straight across the flat ceiling because there's no unit up there, which it's a great product as a traditional insulator too. But yeah, you definitely lose the advantage of an unvented attic, a big advantage when you don't have unit or ductwork up there, for sure.
Can we get Terry Jenkins to state out loud what you just put in the chat? I don't want to just read that. Terry, can you tell us what you just said so everybody can hear it?
Sure. What I was basically saying is the question goes back to humidity in the attic and dehumidifiers. I work on a lot of older homes, and you have to evaluate the entire structure, the whole house. And a lot of times you have a wet basement or wet crawl space, you will have a humidity issue in that attic space if you spray foam up there. So certain situations, people don't want to spend the money downstairs, but they want to do the attic. So in those cases, we absolutely do add dehumidifiers. It's just, like I said, you have to evaluate the entire house before you start changing stuff.
House as a system.
Correct.
I could give you some building science to argue that point, but I'm never going to argue against dehumidifiers. Whether you put them in basements or crawl spaces is never a bad idea at all. But I can tell you, there's plenty of houses that we go in and do nothing but unvented attics, and it changes structures for the better when done properly. The biggest issues you have with unvented attics is when they're not done properly. If any ventilation whatsoever is left, if none of those eaves are sealed properly, or the gable end vents aren't sealed, and you have any issue without outside air getting into that attic, you will run into a whole lot of problems for sure. It really does matter the application. And again, one big reason to have the insulation gone is to know that that attic was sealed properly to the drywall of the floor before. Any other questions on unvented attics before we go to crawls? All right, so Closed cell foam, superior air seal, high R value. We sell it in crawls like we talked about. Closed cell foam, when we started in 1981, we only sprayed closed cell foam, and the most common way that we used it was flash and bat. Flash and bat is still used. If you're not familiar with it, it's a 1/2 inch to 1.5 inches of closed cell foam and then covered with fiberglass bat. And was very popular in the state of Virginia in wall systems. You would see it sometimes in roof decks, not very often. But that was the bulk of our business when we started, was a flash and bat closed cell. So we sprayed closed cell foam for 20 years before we ever got into open cell foam. And it can be used in unvented attics. Again, we don't recommend it in our state, but you go up north and you see a whole lot more of it. All right, so conditioned crawl spaces. What we're doing in the conditioned crawls are creating a mini basement. We're insulating the foundation walls instead of the crawl ceiling. Again, the insulation should be gone in a conditioned crawl. I know you guys are looking in houses that have a conditioned crawl and the insulation was still left in the floor. Best practice is for it to be gone. Not as essential for it to be gone in a crawl space as it is in an attic. I will say that. Thick vapor barrier on the ground gets completely sealed at all seams and piers. Foundation vents are eliminated to control moisture intrusion and relative humidity. Again, if you see insulation on the walls, you should not see open vents in a crawl space. It kind of defeats what it is trying to be done there. Now, in crawls, in new construction, supply air, no return, is 1 CFM per 50 square feet of floor space. This is code required in any new construction. Again, much like the attic, it brings the HVAC equipment, air handler, and ducts into a conditioned space. Duct leakage is now lost into the envelope. We're heating and cooling our crawl spaces anyway. So when the duct leakage is lost back into the house instead of into the crawl space. And to get into the vents of a crawl, you know, vents were put in crawl spaces before insulation was crammed in walls. The whole idea of vents in crawl spaces was before HVAC was around. So air would come into your crawl vents, go up your walls, and it would be a convective loop that would cool the house. Well, we're still building crawl spaces the same way, except we've crammed insulation in the walls. So we're letting all this air under the house and it has nowhere to go but mold on your ductwork, mold on your wood, you know. So we're still seeing crawls built that way, but we're requiring more and more and more insulation. It's really a Stone Age way of building a crawl space. We don't build basements with vents in it. You know, why would we build crawl spaces? And I know you guys are seeing a whole lot more conditioned crawls than you are unvented attics, for sure. And we do conditioned crawl spaces in new and existing homes to tag on what one of the callers talked about. A dehumidifier in an existing home crawl space is a great idea. It's a great idea. All right, condition crawl best practices. Again, the insulation ought to be removed from the floor. Top plate 2 inches exposed to satisfy the pest control inspections. So really, they want to see the top plate, and then they want to see 1 inch down on the wall. 2 inches, they'll let you get away with 3 inches. They'll let you get away sometimes with 1.5 inches. But in general rule, what they want to see is 2 inches. They want to see the top plate, and they want to see a little bit of that block wall. That way they know if any of the termites are tunneling up the wall, building the tunnels to get up to the wood structure. When you seal the walls in a crawl space, really you guys are going to see spray foam, foam board, or what we call blanket insulation. That's the white insulation that you'll see wrapped around hot water heaters. And that's another common way to do conditioned crawl spaces. With a conditioned crawl, you want 6 mil or greater sealed vapor barrier. And one of the big things you'll see on condition crawls is they didn't insulate the access door. What happens a lot of times, especially in new construction, is we'll go and do the condition crawl, and then before the crawl door is put on, and then no one goes back to insulate the crawl door. So when you're going in condition crawls, the door needs to be insulated some way, shape, or form. And there's a bunch of different ways the guys do it. Foam board, we use these zipper covers that you actually go in and unzip to get into the crawl space. But that is a really big spot of weakness is the door. And to complete that entire condition crawl, the door needs to be insulated.
And sealed,
And sealed, correct.
weather.
Like weather strip. And code actually requires that.
Question.
Yes.
If the crawl has a noticeably consistent wetness to it, do you waterproof it before you do all this stuff?
That's a great question. When we go and inspect a crawl and someone wants a condition crawl, we're going to determine whether they ought to have an interior sump pump system. And it does, you know, it adds a lot of money to it, but we do not like or will not condition crawls that are notorious flooding type situations. And you can tell by the staining on the block whether water's sitting in there, just the same kind of things that you're looking at. So yes, we do sell interior sump pump systems to take care of houses like that. And you can do that in a condition crawl and make it a really, really nice space, but you gotta have a way to get the moisture out, because when you seal up the condition crawl, the drying potential is really eliminated. So you better deal with it some way, like a sump pump system. Absolutely.
All right, so you've got 10 minutes left and we got 2 questions at the peanut gallery. Do you want me to take these questions?
Yeah,
Or do-
yeah, I only got a
You wanna
couple
keep taking-
slides left.
All right, okay, good. All right, so Tim, why don't you go next then? Tim Fisher.
Yeah, just a real quick question. If the access panel is into the conditioned airspace of the house, does that still require insulation and weather stripping, or is that only for exterior doors to the crawl space?
Great question. That does not require, you're saying like a basement into a crawl?
Like the first floor into the crawl space?
First, yes, it does not require insulation or weather stripping. Great question.
Thanks.
And Larry, you're next then.
On almost all houses that I look at, a lot of times you'll see a little bit of staining on the very bottom block, like maybe at some point those blocks got a little water in them. If you're sealing up all those walls with a waterproof substance, can those walls start building up moisture inside the concrete block that's just going to migrate up those walls eventually?
That's a great question. In new construction, we waterproof crawls with drain tile and often with a sprayed waterproofing product before it is conditioned to keep that from happening. I would say the answer to your question is yes, you could. If you seal that from the inside and worry about could the block technically fill up with water and then migrate up the wall, I would definitely say there is potential for that. We haven't seen a lot of that, but in theory, I think that could happen. There, building science, there's a lot of theories to building science, and I have my, 25 years of putting it into real practice, installing it, and we've made plenty of mistakes. There are definitely different theories, and a lot of the things that people hate about condition crawls, the termite industry, for instance, is a perfect example. They hate it. Well, the reason that they hate it is because they work. Termites need 2 things. They got to have a food source and they got to have moisture. Nothing controls moisture better under a house than a condition crawl, period. Right. They're in the mold business, So, a lot of these things that could happen in condition crawls, while they're scary, they're very, very rare. And typically when issues occur, it was an installation issue. The poly wasn't done right. The spray foam wasn't done right. The termite strip wasn't done right. The application really is everything when it comes to all these systems. Because to the earlier caller's point, you are taking an existing house and you are changing it by putting a condition crawl under it. you're changing it by putting an unvented attic. So you better be doing it right if you're going to make changes to the house. Is that it? Move on. All right. So real quick, vapor barriers and crawls, sealed vapor barriers, you're seeing 6 is your minimum requirement, 10, 12, up to 20 mil reinforced poly that we're seeing these days. No question, thicker is better. There's no doubt about it. A little bit harder to work with the thicker you go. I often think 20 mil is overkill. 10 mil is very, very tough for you to put a hole through. I can promise you that. And they do get very expensive when you get into those reinforced thicker, but thicker is better. No question about it. Glue seams on 6 and 10 mil, tape seams on 12 and 20. We have now made it a standard. We're taping and gluing all seams. We found that the glue would fail sometimes and the tape would fail sometimes. So we're gluing the seams and then we tape the seams. Again, best practice. Code requires one or the other. You can either tape them or you can glue them. And then I get a lot of questions about laid poly and vented crawl spaces. So the code reads 90% of the ground needs to be covered. We'll get calls from real estate people and say, hey, they say my vapor barrier is inefficient. There's a difference between a sealed vapor barrier and a laid vapor barrier. And a traditionally insulated crawl needs a laid vapor barrier, 90% of the ground being covered. Is it a good idea to do a sealed vapor barrier in a regular insulated crawl? Absolutely. It's a wonderful way to do it. It's an absolutely wonderful way to do it, but it's not required. 90% of the ground needs to be covered in a vented, traditional fiberglass batted crawl space. All right. So just to summarize, spray foam is a plastic. It's no more flammable than wood. We get a lot of questions, how flammable. It has the same burn characteristics as a 2x4. It's no more flammable. The problem with it is if it burns, it puts off some nasty stuff. I mean, that's the issue with it, but it's no more flammable than your wood framing in a home. It is 30 to 70% more efficient than standard insulation. I mean, we've seen houses change, utility bills cut by 70% by doing condition crawls and unvented attics on houses. It makes a world of difference. It is a total project solution. Again, we talked about it a minute ago. You don't have to do unvented attics and condition crawls with spray foam. You can use it where standard insulation. You can do the walls, you can do across the flat ceiling, and you can do the crawl space floor. And to Kevin's point earlier, when they showed that picture of all that insulation falling down, when you spray foam the underfloor of your house, it's never going to settle, sag, or fall down. So it is a great option for just traditionally insulating a house, not necessarily unvented attics and condition crawls. It does tighten a house. I think a couple of the calls kind of probably touched on this. New construction, if you're foaming that thing from the ground walls all the way up, you have to do something to either bring fresh air in or exhaust stale air out. My argument on an existing house with fiberglass bat insulation, nothing I'm going to do to that house is going to make it too tight. Somebody else might argue that, but I can promise you we've seen it. Nothing I'm going to do to the attic is going to make that house too tight. It's going to only improve the heck out of it, but it's not going to make it too tight. But you are seeing in new construction, ERVs, HRVs, duct fans in bathrooms coming on timers to exhaust stale air out. That's our favorite way to do it. We think get the stale air out of the house. It's very, very inexpensive and a wonderful way to get stale air out of a house. And then the final thing is, I mean, spray foam really is the future of insulation. It literally is growing at a 30% clip each year. It's a huge part of our national company's business. They've invested a lot in the equipment and in the people. You're starting to see it spec'd in a lot of government buildings. And like I told you, there's national builders that are making it their insulation of choice, mainly because they're no longer having those room over garage phone call issues that they can't heat and cool it. It really is solving a lot of problems with a solution.
Cost of doing that, 2,000 and crawl at 2,000
You said 2,000, like a 2,000 square foot home? or 2,000 feet of,
General 2,000, get a big house.
okay. So you're probably, regular insulation, you're probably in the $2 a square foot range. Foam would be $4.50 to $5 a square foot. And that would be your crawl space and your attic footage. And that would include the paint that goes over it if required. So it's pricey. It's really 2.5 to 3 times what traditional insulation costs.
That cost coming down?
Well, it was, and you know, the problem is the labor is going up so much. The materials have kind of settled, but you know, you got to have a guy that he has some electrical knowledge, some hydraulic pressure knowledge, and then he's got to be willing to crawl in crawl spaces. You know, you get plenty of the guys that are willing to do it, but they're not smart enough to understand the equipment. And then you get plenty of guys that are super smart enough to understand the equipment, but the working conditions, you know, you're in 120-degree attics in the summertime. I mean, it is hard work. So I would say the cost, it's been pretty stable, I would say, for the last 5 to 7 years.
So before you go, can you just comment about off-gassing and VOCs?
Sure. So with the open cell foam, when this is sprayed, open cell, as it's discussed, the open cells open and off. 95% of the off-gassing occurs when it is sprayed. So the blowing agent blows off. The closed cell foam actually is, as the name says, it's a closed cell that has gas in it. So the concern with this product is, will it off gas for years and years? Well, people compare it to carpet or sofas. You know, does your sofa off gas for years and years? The worst thing that either foam, sunlight will deteriorate it and cause it to off gas more. That's why it's covered, obviously, in walls. But no more off gassing to these products than carpet, your sofa cushions, or anything else. And one of the reasons open cell is so popular is all the off gassing occurs when it's sprayed.
Okay. Thank you a lot.
Can I ask one more question?
We got one more question?
Yeah.
You said you.
I really need to get a clarification about the ignition and thermal barriers, because you were saying that if it's used for storage, it only needs an ignition barrier. But I think it might be that if it's used for storage and it has a floor,
No. Yeah, you're right. If it's used as a storage if it's only deemed accessible for limited storage or unit, ignition barrier, you're right. If it's a full storage attic, the paint has to be sprayed to thermal barrier. You're exactly right.
Whether it's living space or not, it still needs to be full thermal. If it's being used as storage and it has a floor, it has to, yeah, okay. I just wanted to clarify that.
No, you're right. That's exactly right. If it's a walk-up attic that's being used by storage, it either has to have a thermal barrier of drywall or a thermal barrier thickness of paint. That's exactly right.
Or even if it's off a bedroom through a door and there's a floor in
there. Yeah, if it's accessible, it's when it's a pull down or a scuttle hole that the ignition barrier comes in. You're exactly right.
And so my question earlier was, if you walk into one of those attics and, you know, the part that they're storing stuff in, you know, has a thermal barrier, but you can see into other areas of the attic, all of that would need an ignition barrier, wouldn't it?
That's exactly right. You do not have to spray the thermal barrier beyond the storage area, but you're right, because it's interconnected to the storage attic, unless you separate it with drywall, then you're right. That would have to have the ignition barrier because it's interconnected to the storage attic part.
Exactly.
Yes.
So I think that's something that we need to be very aware of when we're doing those inspections.
Absolutely.
And the other thing was, do you recommend that they shrink the size of their air conditioning system for their house after you do their crawl space and attic?
No.
Well, you're gonna have an awfully big air conditioning system in there. It's not gonna pull the moisture out right.
Again, you and I could argue all day long whether I can, we could argue all day long whether that unit's gonna short cycle. In new construction, we've definitely seen it happen. They will design a house for a certain tonnage, foam the thing from the ground up, and then the unit short cycles. Absolutely, no question about it. In an existing home, we haven't seen that happen and don't believe it will. House still leaks plenty.
All right, we need to move on. We're running, we're actually over. So go ahead, John.
Right, you have a raised patio that has steel deck and you can walk under it and it just.
Rains.
Is this a good product for that?
Either open cell or closed cell. We're doing a whole lot more of it with open cell because open cell, that was one of the things we didn't touch on. Open cell is half the cost of closed cell. So in that particular application, plus closed cell has to have a dry, clean palette to spray to. Open cell, because it's water blown, you can spray it to wet metal and it will stick. And we fixed a lot of patios with open cell foam. Yeah, in that application.
All right, Jim, let's do it. One last question.
So in general, you do have to paint in attics, whether it's the thermal barrier or the ignition barrier, but then crawl spaces, you don't have to paint? Is that correct?
Correct. I would
Okay.
say in general, depending on the attic, if it's that has a unit, a lot of the newer houses, it's a pull down attic staircase and it's got 2 sheets of plywood and the only thing up there is the unit and there's no storage because it's trussed and it's not floored. That does not have to have paint on it. The thermal barrier of the drywall is your thermal barrier.
Okay. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much.